Hello and welcome to the University of Edinburgh's Research Insights. Thank you for joining us. My name is Hazel Lambert, I'll be your host, and I'm joined this afternoon by psychologist Dr. Sinead Rhodes and Nick, Jen and Jen, who are making everything work like magic in the background. Sinead, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Hi everyone.
Hi. This event is being recorded, but everyone watching, your cameras and mics are off, so we can't see you, we can't hear you. We are recording the event, so if you'd like to share it with your friends or watch it again later, you can access all the previous Research Insights videos on our website. Remember, these events are your chance to ask our experts questions, so the Q&A box is open. Type in there, try to keep them short, and you can upvote any that you think you really want to be asked, so I can see which are most in demand. And we'll have plenty of time for discussion after Sinead has shared her work. So most of the research that you hear about in the news or that we've covered so far in this series happens in labs, in buildings that you might never have a reason to go into. But research also happens around us every day in our communities. And we're going to cover another example of that in one of our March events, when the Generation Scotland team talks about their research into all our different experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic. But today, Sinead is going to tell us all about how young people who have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, or autism contribute to her research. And none of that happens in a lab. Dr. Sinead Rhodes is an academic psychologist. That means she's trying to understand aspects of human behaviour and how the brain works in different ways. She leads research in the Centre for Clinical Brain Sciences here at the university. And one of the most important elements of her work is that she does it together with the young people it aims to benefit. So Sinead, when you're ready, please start sharing your screen. And it's over to you. I think if you just pop it onto presenter mode, Sinead, it should work okay. And for everyone watching, we know it's a little bit pixelated. There we go, got it. It will clear up as we move on. Some of us have better internet connections than others, don't they? But Sinead has gone to a lot of effort to make sure she's got the best connection possible this evening. So when you're ready, Sinead, over to you.
Thanks, Hazel. As Hazel described, I'm a developmental psychologist who conducts research with children. And first, I just want to give you a bit of an overview of what an academic psychologist does. I think it's useful to first point out that there are many different types of psychologists and different areas of psychological research. Some, like me, look at memory and thinking processes. Others look at social interactions. Some look at children or adults who are developing typically, and others look at individuals who have clinical disorders. Developmental psychologists most often work with children, but others look at development at other age points or look at developmental changes across the lifespan. Academic research psychologists do research in many different locations. Some work in labs, and others conduct their research in the community. So, for example, in schools or in homes. Very importantly, we involve children, their families and teachers who take part in our studies in designing our research. The research questions we ask are those that they have prioritized as important to their lives. In general, when we think of what a scientific researcher does, we often tend to think of people working in labs, like you can see in these images. When people are asked what first springs to mind when they hear the term scientist, they often say someone who works with chemicals or someone who looks at cells. Psychologists conduct research using scientific methods, and most often do so by studying people directly, in my case, children, either by observing them directly, asking them to complete questionnaires, or to complete tasks on an iPad or a laptop, like you can see this child on the iPad here. The type of tasks we use is influenced by the people who take part in our research. At the design stage of a study, so before we even start, we gain their input into our measure choices. And children often show a preference for game-like tasks they can do on an iPad with us. The research that I conduct is mainly with children who've been diagnosed with one or more neurodevelopmental disorders. So you're likely to have heard of autism, which is a disorder characterized mainly by social communication difficulties. But even more commonly diagnosed are DCD, which stands for Developmental Coordination Disorder, and sometimes is referred to as dyspraxia, and ADHD, which stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Children with DCD have difficulties in fine and gross motor functions. So think of being able to hold a pencil or riding a bike. But they also often have difficulties in cognitive function. So what do we mean by cognitive function? This is thinking difficulties, like we would have in attention, memory, and planning. And another disorder characterized by thinking difficulties is ADHD. And this is the area where I have focused most of my research. Now, while sometimes we ask a child with these disorders to come into a university, lab, or clinical setting to take part in research, we mostly do this research in the community. Often, this is because we want to see the child in the setting that they are comfortable and most used to, but also because we usually don't just collect the data with the child, but most typically also with their parents and often their teacher. If we have questionnaires we would like the family to look to fill out, it's most straightforward to actually visit the family at their home and do that. In some of the research that I conduct, we look at children's learning. And in our pre-design work, children have shown very strong preferences to want to do tasks that involve, like English and maths, in the place where they are used to doing that type of work, so at school. And going to the school also means that we can collect data from their teacher, which is often very informative. And what this does is provides us with a multi-informant account that is really useful in being able to truly understand the child. As I mentioned, a lot of my research has looked at thinking processes in children with ADHD. And in particular, I have looked at the A part of ADHD. So that refers to attention. And actually, this research and the work of other groups has shown that this label of attention is really poor at describing the thinking difficulties these children show. Indeed, in one study, the difference between the children and their peers who did not have ADHD was the smallest on the attention tasks of all the tasks that we'd included. What this research has shown is that these children show a much broader range of thinking difficulties than attention. We know that many children with ADHD show difficulties in what are called executive functions. So what do I mean by executive functions? Well, think about the executive in a business. This is exactly the same concept. The executive plans out everything, makes strategies so the work can be done the most effectively, and basically organizes the work to be done. Executive functions from a psychological point of view involve things like updating and organizing information in your memory, planning out all the steps in a task, working from the end of the task backwards. And while many children with ADHD show executive function difficulties, but yet again, still, this is only part of the picture, accounting for the difficulties that they have. There are a diverse, range of other difficulties these children have, but one of the key aspects that we know many of these children have difficulties with is memory. So I mentioned memory in the executive function bit, but here I don't mean the sort of more tricky organizational bit. I mean just like holding information in short or long-term memory, such as when, someone is calling out their phone number to you and you don't have pen and paper to write it down and you just rehearse that in your memory. So what I want to really show you in the next few slides is how we measure these thinking processes so that we can come to a conclusion as to whether these children have difficulties in attention or this kind of, strategic thinking, or actually it's a memory problem. And I want to sort of get across to you how completing a task like the one on the screen now reveals what that A in ADHD actually means on a specific psychological level. But first, just to take a step back, how do we actually choose what aspects of thinking to measure in our research in the first place? Well, one of the things that we do is actually speak to children, their parents, and teachers to find out, asking questions. We do interviews with children and teachers in particular to see what kind of difficulties that they feel are most prominent. And then we're able to sort of pick out words like memory and planning, etc. But we also have psychological models that have been developed that guide our research. The most popular and evidence model describes memory, for example, in relation to different components or types. And there's one component where we just store and hold information in memory. Think about that, rehearsal of the phone number. But there's another component involved in that executive bit that I was describing. So where you have to organize information in your memory and use strategies, for example. The task I'm showing you here taps into both types of those memory. The good thing, as you can see, the task looks quite like a game. And when we designed this research, children and their parents indicated that they would prefer to do this kind of task on an iPad rather than, say, answer questions about their memory. So how did they do this task? On this task, it's a touchscreen. The child searches inside the boxes to find a blue token, like this one here. And they're told to remember where they found the blue tokens and not to return back to those boxes. So they grab a blue token and they put it into that column on the right-hand side until they fill it up. This trial is quite easy. There's only 3 boxes on it, but the task gets harder and harder and goes right up to 8 boxes. The interesting part is that other researchers have conducted studies with imaging and have had people complete these tasks in imaging scanners. So we know the exact parts of the brain involved when someone does this task. We found that children with ADHD make more errors than other children without ADHD, particularly when the task became difficult. And one of the key things was that they were less likely to use a strategy to help their memory. So other children tended to start at the same place, whereas the children with ADHD started more randomly each time. And this doesn't really support or enhance your memory for the items. In our work, we've also included a range of more basic memory tasks where they just tap into one of that, psychological models component. And in this task, holding information in memory. Here on this task, they see an image. Now, you can see by this image, it's quite abstract. And the whole idea that's purposeful. It's so that the child can't use a strategy to remember it, because we're just wanting to look at how they maintain information in memory. Sometimes children do come up with, funny things like they'll say, oh, the green thing looks like the front of a bus, or, some part of it looks like an animal. But, that's just really them, sort of the comedy factor. The pattern is abstract, so they deliberately cannot use a strategy to remember it. And what happens in this task is that we ask them to pay attention, because we want to look at how they can pay attention, and what we look for them to encode it into memory. So that means we're looking for them to learn and to be able to remember the item. So they see the pattern and they pay attention to it and try and learn it. And then in the next condition, the pattern covers over, and the patterns to choose the response options, one of which is exactly the same, either appear immediately. So this means they've had to pay attention to the item, but they don't have to hold it in memory because they get to choose straight away. And what we find here in this condition is that children with ADHD perform exactly like their peers without ADHD. But there are other conditions, and sometimes those response options don't appear for quite a long time. Well, it seems quite a long time for these children, up to 12 seconds. And what we find is a marked deterioration in being able to do the task, particularly at the longest delay level. And I hope that you can see by using these tasks, we can now pick apart what the psychological difficulties are, because the children were actually able to pay attention and encode those items into their memory. The difficulty lay in being able to hold it in memory over time. And we now think that this is why these children often seem forgetful or distracted, if they're being given a set of instructions or following a story. It's not that they were necessarily not paying attention, but it's that the information disappears more quickly in their memory store than it does for other children. So now we have a better understanding of the thinking difficulties these children have, and they're actually even more diverse than I've been able to describe today. What can we do to help with these difficulties? Well, for children with ADHD, medication is a very common treatment and has been shown to have a significant positive impact on a range of aspects of thinking functions for many children with ADHD. In the research that I've conducted, we've looked at the effect of stimulant medication on thinking processes scientifically. And in one of the studies I conducted, we did what's called a randomized controlled trial. So you can see occasion one, we tested children before they ever took medication, and then the children with ADHD went into this medication trial. And we assessed the children to their response to an acute challenge, what we call an acute challenge of the medication. So in this case, their first ever dose of the medication. So they're randomized into groups, or they receive where they receive medication at different doses or a dummy drug. And then the children go into what we call chronic conditions of the trial. So they continue to take the medication for longer periods. And this is really quite a neat scientific design because they are effectively their own control if you look at the 3, 4, and 5 challenges, because each child receives the different doses and the dummy drug. So we're able to compare their performance under these different conditions. And what we do is those tasks that I described, like the memory tasks, we have the child complete these after, within each of these conditions. And we also ask the parents and teachers to complete questionnaires at each of these stages. Now, this study was really important in terms of the findings, because at the time that we conducted this, it was taught that the way clinicians and teachers thought about medication was actually different to what we actually found. So it was thought at the time, before this study and other studies, that this medication acted to slow down or pause the child. So then they were sitting in their chair and they're more likely to pay attention and they're more likely to complete the task. But that's not actually what we found. It wasn't selective in that way. So what we found was that, yes, sometimes the medication slowed them down. But on tasks that were quite complex, tasks that we said, stop and think before you start this task. But on other tasks, like this reaction time task, being on medication actually speeded up their performance. So you can think of, tasks that you'll do, sort of computer game tasks where it's good to be fast. We were actively encouraging the children to be fast on this task. And what we found was that medication speeded up the performance. So I hope you can see that from this research, we can begin to blow away myths, basically, and actually show how the medication is working. And what it's showing is that it works on self-regulation. It regulates the child to the task requirements that they're doing, speeding them up if that's the best thing to do, but also slowing them down if that's actually the better option to do to better complete the task. And medication also works on some other aspects, including memory. So do you remember this task where the child had a difficulty when they had to hold information over the delay? And what we found was that, again, medication improved the performance of children on this task. So now they were able to remember information just like their peers. And again, we think that this is why on medication, children with ADHD seem to be following instructions better, following a story, for example. But another critical finding was that medication didn't improve everything. There were a lot of aspects of the difficulties these children have that were not improved by medication. And this included many of, do you remember the executive function that I described? So being able to use strategies, being able to think flexibly, being able to organize information in your memory. We saw little or no effects for many of these areas. And a really important thing is that several groups have followed children with ADHD longitudinally and have found that even using lengthy medication prescription, they still, as they go into adulthood, show difficulties in long-term outcomes, particularly academic outcomes. So this means that we need to develop interventions to help children with ADHD to supplement the medication in relation to their thinking and learning and their well-being, their other developmental outcomes. Most interventions that have been developed have focused on one area of difficulty. You can tell from what I've been saying that there are many different types of thinking difficulties involved. So we need much more complex interventions that tackle multiple thinking components, like some of the areas that I'm showing on the slide, and you can see they're quite diverse. We've been developing an intervention, and the way that we've been developing it is called a co-production model. So we are basically co-producing this with children and their teachers. Obviously, some of what we're doing comes from our experience, comes from the research literature, but it also comes from, for example, conducting interviews with children and their teachers to find out what areas of difficulty are the most important for them, mostly affect, for example, their abilities in the classroom and the kind of strategies that they use. A key part of this approach is profiling children's difficulties, because children, even with the same diagnosis, will vary in their kind of exact profile of whether memory is more of a problem for them or planning, for example. And we look at a whole range of other difficulties that might be affecting their behaviour in the home or their ability to complete schoolwork in the classroom, such as emotional regulation, being able to regulate your emotions, and things like confidence. One of the most important parts of this intervention that we're co-producing with children and their teachers is what we call psychoeducation. And what we mean by this is the child, the parent, and the teacher's understanding of that individual child's thinking profile. Because remember, it differs, to some degree from child to child. And one of the main things we're assessing is how we compare the individual child's thinking profile with strategies. So say, for example, for this particular child, they have a memory difficulty. Being able to pair that with strategies like chunking. So for example, if they were learning the number 101, they had to remember that for some reason, that we would encourage them to chunk that into like 101 Dalmatians. And actually that taps into imagery as well, because we could ask them to imagine the Dalmatian. So they're using different techniques to aid their memory. But we also look at the broader picture and in terms of other ADHD features, and the fact that many of these children also might show a co-occurring condition like autism or DCD, etc. And look at other ADHD features though as well, such as what, for example, I mentioned a moment ago, being able to regulate your emotions. On the topic of emotion in neurodevelopmental disorders, and I mean now beyond ADHD, we know that children with any of these neurodevelopmental disorders that I've been referring to, so not just ADHD, but also autism and DCD, these children have a much higher risk of developing mental health difficulties than other children, than their peers, especially depression and anxiety. We still don't really know why this is the case. For a long time, it was thought that it is maybe because these children experience more social problems like bullying, and that this might raise their risk. But we know that doesn't explain the raised risk, in full. And one of the areas we have begun to look at is memory and executive functions. And the reason for this is that because we know, obviously, these are a difficulty for many of these children, not just with ADHD, but with the other disorders that I've mentioned. But memory and executive functions are also a key feature of depression for people in the general population. So what I mean is children and adults who don't have a neurodevelopmental disorder, they also, often show memory and executive function difficulties. So we're now looking at these thinking differences in neurodevelopmental disorders to see if they explain at least some of the higher risk. And why is that important? Well, understanding the features that underlie depression in these children can help us to develop appropriate psychological interventions and inform use of medication treatments. Again, we conduct this research in the community to ensure we hear the voice of all the key people concerned, the child, their parent and teachers. And this enables us also to collect the complex data that we need to understand these issues. Ultimately, though, our aim is to address the main difficulties that these children feel are important to their lives. So finally, before I end, so that's the end of the sort of psychology bit, I want to touch on a more general issue about scientific research. This very much applies to psychology, but it applies to sort of all academic research. And I just want to have a quick chat with you about how researchers share their findings and how you can best appraise research and develop skills to do so. Researchers share their findings very commonly, obviously, with one another, and we publish them in academic articles. You can see that on your screen just now. And we also present them at academic conferences, for example. The public don't tend to see these, but you may hear about research through like an event like this, or another community event. Most commonly, though, you'll come across research findings on the news and social media in particular, especially if you're on Facebook or Twitter, where we commonly see organisations like charities sharing research findings. But I guess it depends on who you're following. Many times these reports are accurate, but that's not always the case. And often, especially headlines are misleading or sensationalist, like this one. That's to grab your attention and make you click, so they get more money from advertising. And, hey, we're in lockdown. It would be great if 2 minutes exercise will stop you aging. You can see why people would click on that at the present time. The problem is when we go into the academic paper often that reports the research, you often find the results don't quite match up to the headline. And this is why it's really important to read the whole news story and go behind the headline, but also not just read the whole story, but ask questions about the research that you read. But once you start getting into that process of asking the questions, where, can you find resources? What resources can you trust? Where can you find them? And how do you know you can rely on them to provide an accurate account? Well, there are a number of established web projects, quite a range of them now, actually. I'm just showing you two here on the screen, and that are devoted to this work. One example you can see on the left-hand side is the Science Media Centre blog, and this is an amazing resource. They regularly interview experts and they summarise key research findings in a way that's like really easy to follow and meaningful, and that can be trusted. Another project you can see on the right-hand side is Research the Headlines. Actually, it's showing a psychology study. And this is a blog I set up with members of the Young Academy of Scotland. So this is a Scottish project. And on that blog, you'll find lots of discussion posts about research in the media and across a really broad range of topics, not just psychology, but also health, right through to economics and astronomy. I hope you found my talk informative. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, please do post them in the Q&A. Thank you.
Sinead, thank you so much. I really wish that 2 minutes exercise did stop us all aging. That would be fantastic, wouldn't it? You always have to read beyond the headline. And we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A box already. If anybody else who's watching would like to ask Sinead something, this is your opportunity. Remember, you can also ask career-y type questions as well, like what kind of training she did to get into this area of work if you'd like to. And I'm sorry, some of the slides were quite difficult to read there, but Sinead gave such a clear talk that I think you'll have got the messages anyway. So let's start right at the beginning. Sinead, you spoke about ADHD and autism, these neurodiverse conditions in your talk. So differences in how people's brains work. And I know that one of the things that you think is really important is that people understand that these aren't deficits, that there can be huge advantages to children as well of having neuro differences. So what do people need to know about neurodiversity from your perspective?
I think it's really important, 20, 25 years ago when I started this research, we did talk about deficits and impairments. That was the language. And we've moved away from that. It's not helpful. I think it's really important that we do, though, acknowledge that for many of these children, they have difficulties. And often these difficulties can be quite complex, even though the child may appear very, very functional and in mainstream school, etc. And we talk more, our language is more about strengths and difficulties. And many of these children have huge strengths, like, every child has strengths. And it's about, taking that balanced view. And really, often their strengths are things that they're really motivated in and really interested in. And that can be something very academic. Some of these children are really, really into, aspects of science. For other children, sort of expressive and creative arts are more of an aspect, but it really comes down to actually what the child is motivated in. I think just, in terms of how people can understand them, I think we always need to go beyond the label. So there's a saying that if you've met one child with autism or you've met one child with ADHD, you've only met that one child. The label it gives you an indication of some of the difficulties, of many of the difficulties the child has, but it doesn't tell you everything. So the best way to support a child with any of these conditions is to actually find out more about them, from observing them, from working with them, from asking them, and to identify the ways in which you can support them, and really in terms of the subjects, the topics, the hobbies that they're most interested in.
I love how in your talk you said that you go to young people right at the beginning of your research and that they then influence the direction it takes. Have you ever gone to a group of young people with an idea and then they've just said, no, you've got that really wrong. That's just, you're thinking about it the wrong way?
Slightly. So I remember quite some time back going to talk to some parents of children with ADHD. And it was actually, because we look at the procedural aspects, not just the design in terms of, what's important. And we suggested that we would, because the involvement in the study was quite significant, and that, within research studies, we often, reimburse or give a sort of token of, thanks to the participants. And I suggested that we gave these families cinema tickets, because I thought it was, the right figure, and it was something positive for the family. It was something the child was getting for the family. I had all these reasons why I thought this was brilliant. The child was winning this cinema ticket for the family. And the mothers all just laughed and went, we don't go to the cinema. They like off medication. So off medication, the child, at that stage, they were sort of younger children. This wasn't sort of the best.
That just shows, doesn't it, the value of including the people that you're trying to do research to benefit, of including their perspective, doesn't it? I'll move over to the question box, and actually there's one that fits in nicely there from Monica, and she says, can autistic children learn how to cope with social skills, improve their concentration and their ability to follow instructions so that they can be successful in higher education and on moving on into jobs?
Absolutely. So in the approach that we're taking, so in the current development of the intervention that we're conducting, while it's focused on children with ADHD, several of the children have autism as well, because that's what happens. These conditions co-occur. And so, the answer is the same for a child with ADHD or autism. We can absolutely, with the right support, these children can completely fulfill their potential. But we really need to get to grips both with research and in supporting them with the complex range of difficulties, and not to view that, that child looks very functional. It's obviously a sort of hidden difficulty. You can't see it from that person's demeanor, from their face, etc. And I think we really have to get beyond that, because yes, absolutely, we can support these people with the right types of support. In some cases, in ADHD, that's medication. But these kind of interventions, and there's a whole range of other interventions, and parenting interventions, and behavioural interventions, and memory interventions that can help absolutely these children, achieve their potential.
Following on, talking about interventions, question from Richard Fitzpatrick, and he says, thinking about children liking to gamify experimental designs, is that something you've also considered when you're thinking about intervention strategies? Is there a way to gamify the interventions themselves?
Yeah, I think that potentially is going to be the next phase of what we do, in terms of potentially moving this into older teenagers, high school pupils. At the moment, we're working with mainly sort of early primary. And so we're doing a lot of things around games. So we play snakes and ladders and switch the rules around, and do things like learn about cognitive flexibility and planning, etc. Connect 4, brilliant for planning. But yeah, gaming, these children are often very interested in games. And obviously now on lockdown, we've had to change our tactics quite a bit. and we're doing some of the intervention sessions online, and we have been doing, sort of two-way, sort of games online, like you've described. But, it's interesting actually when we've been forced into these kind of situations, it opens up sort of other sort of possibilities. But yeah, and I think fundamentally for some children, computer games, video games, they often get a bad press, but if that's what the child is really interested in and motivated to do, you can absolutely use that to explain and sort of, with psychoeducation, explain what slowing down, planning is all about, speeding up why, in that game, you would respond really quickly, and that's really good to do. So the whole thing about, task requirements, and some tasks, it's good to be slow, and some tasks it's not. Absolutely, those kind of mediums are very useful, and often because they're so meaningful and of interest to the child.
And going back to lockdown, the most popular question here is, how do you think lockdown has affected children with ADHD?
That varies hugely. I mean, I've been involved in research, and actually a preprint of a study that I'm a co-author on was published today, looking at children across the UK with additional sport needs or developmental disorders. And it does show, that for many children, there has been an impact on anxiety, well-being, and learning. It does differ from child to child, and it's very complex. It will depend. It's the resources issue. It's the if parents are working. For some children, lockdown has actually been a positive thing, especially if there's social interaction difficulties, and also for children with ADHD and DCD, where there's a lot of difficulties in both of those disorders in executive functions and the whole sort of multitasking. And now, all the complex cues of their peers talking and, noises going on is gone. And actually they can complete something, and then they can in their own time ask questions. So actually for many children, it's been a positive. And when we look at charities, so for example, like the ADHD Foundation and sort of other parent forums, you really do see a mix of answers to that question. For some children, it's definitely been positive. For many other children, it hasn't been. And there's a whole kind of complex range of reasons behind each child's.
And you mentioned there's some things you're doing in your research that you wouldn't have done pre-lockdown, because there would never have been the need to it. And one of the questions that we have here from Phoebe Morris, thanks for your question, she says, how do you overcome the barriers associated with conducting research in the community during lockdown, especially when face-to-face research can't really happen at the moment? Some face-to-face research can happen, can't it?
Yeah, we've actually been in schools, obviously not in the most extreme lockdown, so we're now online only, but obviously positive news, early primary is opening back up again, and that's many of the children are in those years. It's really, really difficult, and the whole stop-start, well, everyone's lives in the last year have been affected by the stop-start, and, sort of research is no different. I mean, our argument is that if you look at what we're doing, this was never more important than it is now. Some of the children, that we will work with will have had a huge hit to their numeracy, and literally more so than their peers, because this was an issue in the first place. So we're navigating that, and schools have been amazing in allowing us in many, circumstances. So we're in right through from September to Christmas, and also now in engaging with us online. And we've actually, there's a positive. So the parents, we've expanded the research out, and now parents are part of the picture because they're on the end of the Zoom call with the child. And also just, I think that there will be more sort of useful things coming out of the lockdown impact on research, that many things that we thought we couldn't do online, we now can, like this meeting, which can now go out to way more people than in one Edinburgh, say, high school.
Yeah. And building on that, there's a question from Elliot, who's asking, what insight do teachers provide about the children that parents do not? And there's a couple of questions here, actually. So first one is about, what do you get from the teachers that you wouldn't get from the parents? And then how do you address possible bias, considering that some children with ADHD struggle at school and might not have a good relationship with their teacher? But let's go with the what do you get from the teachers first.
Yeah, so in this study, we're now involving parents, but we didn't pre-lockdown, so that became an artifact of lockdown. But we do, have conversations with parents. I think they're just coming from a different context, and the teacher is seeing the child obviously out with lockdown in a classroom full of other children, and it can be quite tricky because often these children, what you first see in a classroom setting is, kind of hyperactivity, impulsivity, what's perceived as behavioral problems, but often actually what's behind that is learning difficulties, not being able to keep up with what's going on in the class. Often these children have co-occurring autism, so they have sensory difficulties, so it looks like they're being badly behaved, but they find it difficult to tune out the noises, in the class. So we get a very different perspective from teachers, because obviously in the home, unless there's lots and lots of children, often there's a different sort of dynamic, and obviously the parent-teacher relationship with the child is very different. The second aspect, in terms of the child's bias, I mean, we have conducted interviews with these children. I also do a lot of work going out to, out with lockdown, going out to parent support groups where children are there and talking to children and their parents. And we ask children honest questions about what their situation is, and follow up with more in-depth questions to try and ascertain what might be behind acting in a certain way, or having what looks like a certain type of learning difficulty.
Thank you. Next most popular question is about the medication that you spoke about, a trial that you did where you were giving first dose and testing and seeing what happened. So there's two questions there. One about how medication actually helps reduce symptoms. You were speaking about self-regulation. And then secondly, how did you choose the medication that you used in that trial? So first, how does it work? And then how did you choose it for the trial?
So it was part of a trial through what we call Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, and I've done other work where we looked at sort of children on medication. And at the time that we've done those studies, that was methylphenidate, which is stimulant medication, and is the most popular medication. It's what the children are routinely taking. Children are now taking a more sort of diverse set of medication than that sort of earlier study. So that's, the choice. It's basically what's routinely used in clinical practice. And in terms of the other question, in terms of how medication works on symptoms, so what we measure at each of those 5 conditions. There's a lot of information in that slide, but I showed across that there was 5 different conditions, and each time point we asked parents and teachers to fill out what we call the Conners questionnaire, which gives a list of ADHD symptoms. So ADHD symptoms are inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. I didn't go into a lot of depth about that because I focus on thinking difficulties, and as you'll have seen in the talk, I'm concluding that attention isn't a very good, descriptor. But the medication does for about 70% of children. So it doesn't impact all children. We still don't fully know why that's the case, but for quite a lot of children, we see a clinically significant effect on that triad of impairments: the attention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. And then obviously what our research has shown is that this is, we see this effect on self-regulation in terms of speeding up and slowing down their performance, and in terms of a range of aspects of memory.
Thank you. We've got time for one last question, so I'm going to ask you the most popular one, and it's from Jamie, and he's asking, cigarette smoke and alcohol consumption have been shown to increase the risk of having an ADHD child. Do you know why that is? And is that correct? Is it true that cigarette smoke and alcohol consumption are...
Yeah, it's a lot more complex than that, and I think you have to be careful about coming to sort of specific conclusions. The answer to that is a lot more complex. There's a group led by Anita Thapper who's done a lot of the research on smoking. This is an issue in many neurodevelopmental disorders. We see in research these explanations have been put forward. What I will say, that there is very strong genetic evidence in terms of the causal pathway for ADHD and indeed, DCD and autism. So basically the story is a lot more complex than A causes B.
Yeah, and that's why I always have to go behind the headlines, isn't it? And why
exactly. That's a very good example.
Story. Actually, on that note, you mentioned a preprint. Where can people find it if they want to have a look at it?
If they follow at Sinead Rhodes, it was being posted today. Okay. So my Twitter handle is just my name, at Sinead Rhodes, and that was being posted earlier today.
And Amanda, you had asked where can you find the videos of the previous events? They're on our webpage. I'll put the link in the feedback email from here. It's edin.ac/research-insights. So Sinead, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everyone for your questions. There were loads there. We couldn't quite get through them all, but that's always good because it shows people are interested in what you're saying. And thank you to the rest of the communications team for running the webinar. These events are our way to share research with you while we're all under these stay-at-home orders, but we really want to know what you would like to hear about, and so we're keeping the last event in March to be curated by our audience. So I'm going to put up a slide now to something called menti.com. If I can just share my screen, and we'll leave it there for the next couple of minutes. And if you would like to tell us what you're really interested in, what topic you would love to see covered in one of these sessions, then I'll go with the most popular one. I will be back on the 17th of February with another scientist-clinician pairing. We'll be talking about endometriosis and how people who live with it are influencing the direction of research there too. You can sign up on the website if you'd like to join us. So thank you so much for coming along this evening. Take care, stay cozy at home, and I hope you can join us again in the future. Bye.